Nietzsche's early metaphysics is the metaphysics from his early period, which is around the time of his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and a couple of years before that. And it's a metaphysics in the sense that it's about nature as a whole, not in the sense of anything supernatural or transcendental or anything like that, because for Nietzsche there's nothing like that. Um, well, so it's about nature as a whole. Well, let's first say what we mean by nature. Nature is like the cosmic process. It's time itself. It's matter, as we'd call it, colliding into each other and forming structures and destroying structures. So that's what nature is, and it includes the human world, of course, the animal world, plant world, everything basically that science studies. So that's nature. But according to Nietzsche, that's not nature simply. Nature simply is nature if we could see it from a higher dimension, because then it would not be in flux, but it would be one solid block of time, a being. And he called this being the primordial one, or the primal unity. And this primal unity, it has being in the Parmenidean sense, as opposed to Heraclitean becoming. And it is a whole, it is one, a primordial one, and as such it is everything there is. So there's one thing that is everything there is. So we could say that this being has overfullness. It alone, it by itself, is everything there is. Just imagine that. And actually everything there is has to be infinite, because if it would be enclosed by nothing, that would mean it would not be enclosed by anything. So we have this one infinite being which is everything, and that's a problem, because it suffers from its overfullness. And in order to relieve itself from this suffering, from its overfullness, it imagines that it itself is fragmented into, into us, for example, into all kinds of beings, including human beings, who are scattered in time and collide into each other all the time. So basically nature as we know it, the world as we know it, is an imaginary self-fragmentation on the part of the primordial one. But we usually experience our being, our existence as very real. And we suffer from it because in order to relieve itself from its being, its overfullness, and its, well, literally its overjoyedness, the primordial one imagines itself as many beings fragmented. It's many beings, so not one being, becoming, not being, and in lack as opposed to overfullness, and suffering as opposed to overjoyed. So we as beings, as imaginary fragments, are characterized by becoming, manifoldness, lack, and woe. And in order to relieve ourselves from these things, we again imagine, and that's in our with our mind's eye actually. We imagine things in dreams, for example, but also daydreams, just fantasizing about things which are not transient, about oneness, about eternity, about eternal joy, and about fullness. And that's the Apollonian world, or Apollonian as it's also called, but it's better to say Apollonian. This Apollonian world exists in the mind's eye, as I said, or in dreams, which are also in the mind's eye, mind's senses. let's just say the mind's eye. And for example, we imagine gods, like in ancient times, like the Greeks, they imagined many gods, like Zeus and Athena, and those were beings who were characterized by eternity. They were immortal. They were, well, they could have many passions, but still they would always be joyful, because they had luxury. They were rich in everything, not just materially, and so they had this fullness. They drank nectar and ate ambrosia all the time. So this fullness, this opulence. So that's what we imagine in order to relieve ourselves from what characterizes us as individuals, namely um, what characterizes us is becoming, lack, and woe, basically. But we can also, because we actually are in our deepest self, we are the primordial one. We are just imaginary fragments of the primordial one. Okay, well, let's first say the Apollinian artist. Apollinian art is basically this imagining of, well, for instance, Olympian gods, um, and then mostly actually transferring that vision of those gods, for example, into a statue by um, putting our vision of Zeus in marble and making a sculpture of Zeus. That's Apollinian art. But the basis of Apollinian art is fantasy and not sculpting, for instance, but the vision itself. That's Apollinian. But as we said, this world, the world as we know it, is basically a vision by the primordial one, hallucination. Though it's not outside of it, because it's not the primordial one, who could be called Nietzsche, the god of Nietzsche's early metaphysics. Um, he is not. I mean, I should say it is not, because it's neuter in German, and actually the word God originally also was neuter. So it's is not transcendent to the world as we know it, but it's immanent to it, because the world as we know it is just a fragmentary, no, an imaginary fragmentation of the primordial one. Yeah, so we talked about what Apollinian art is, which is basically the art of vision. For example, imagining the Olympus with its gods. But there's also Dionysian art, and the basis of this is that one somehow knows to put oneself in the position of the primordial one. So basically, one can see this whole, well, the world as we know it as a great vision, as a dream, basically. Um, a dream which is characterized by becoming, lack, and woe, but because it's a dream, it can be enjoyed aesthetically. Actually, by putting ourselves in the position of the primordial one and identifying ourselves with its being, its overfullness, and its overjoyedness, we can enjoy the world as we know it as an imaginary relief. Well, not just imaginary relief, a relief from this overfullness, etc., which causes us to suffer, well, which causes the primordial one to suffer, actually. We can see the world as the primordial one sees it, as a vision which relieves it from its overfullness, a vision of lack and woe, and, well, a dark vision by this abyss of light, which is the primordial one. And the primordial one can also see the visions had by its imaginary fragments. So, for instance, our dreams. because we are the primordial one. So whatever we dream is also really dreamt not by us, because we are imaginary fragments, but by the primordial one. Um, so the Dionysian artist is the artist, or the man or woman who can somehow put himself, and that's usually done by intoxication, um, in the position of the primordial one, and experience the world, enjoy the world from that perspective, as a vision to relieve the primordial one from overfullness. Yes, I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's not easy stuff. Um, well, that's Dionysian art, and the highest form of art is the art which is at the same time Dionysian and Apollonian. That's when someone who is intoxicated or inspired and is well, identifying himself with the primordial one and enjoying the world, which is full of lack and woe, as a relief from overfullness and overjoyedness. Um, when that person, for example, the lyrical poet Archilochus, the Greek poet, when he is in that position, but then has an Apollonian vision while in that state, that intoxicated state, then he can make write lyric poems, for example. So a poem in which well, there are beings, there is fantasy. Um, like I could write a song, which is basically what lyrical poetry is, um, about, well, whatever I want. It could be something that really exists, like some of the tragedies, the Greek tragedies, um, were about, well, for instance, the Persian Wars, which actually occurred. But it could also be something imaginary, like Prometheus being bound to the, I don't know, Caucasus, I think. Um, and then the person who is identifying with the primordial one is making Apollonian art, and that art is then both Apollonian and Dionysian, because as Nietzsche says, in lyric poetry or in a really inspired song, when the poet says I, or the singer sings I, it's not the I, the individual, the you know, like the ego, but it's the I which stems from the abyss of being, from the primordial one itself. It is I, the primordial one. Um, so I, the cosmic Dionysus, basically. And so when an inspired poet, lyrical poet or singer writes something, a song or a lyrical poem, where in which he speaks of himself, then it's not really himself, but the I of the primordial one. Even though, of course, he keeps seeing things from the perspective of his individual self. So, for instance, Archilochus. Well, actually, there are only fragments extant of Archilochus, but he's said to have written about himself and his ardent love, his passionate love and hate of a certain girl, or certain girls, even sisters, I think. And but as Nietzsche says, then when we hear him speak of his own experiences, his own hate and love for these girls, um, then, well, that would be completely uninteresting if it was just, um, him describing his life, except for, of course, for historical, yeah, for the historical value. But other than that, it's just some guy with some girls, and it's the um, just the passing of everyday human events, and that's not why it's interesting. It's interesting because that's not what it is. We see, as Nietzsche says, we see not Archilochus and those girls, but we see Dionysus and the Maenads, the mad women who were the female companions of Dionysus, female human companions of Dionysus, who went with him in his parades, which is the komos, of which the word comic derives. And that's why it's interesting, because we see the primordial one. We see Dionysus, not the cosmic Dionysus, but his incarnation in a human Dionysus who walks the earth. And I guess that's basically it. So for now, this was Nietzsche's early metaphysics. Thank you.